Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Christensen, and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, a gathering place for fellow fiends the world over to discuss all things freaky and frightening. If you want to be part of the conversation, and I hope you do, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, maybe go back and check out some of our previous episodes, leave a comment, and most importantly, let us know the fright flicks you'd like to discuss in the future. That kind of connection is exactly what we're looking for, and it really does make a difference. We're all about sharing the scare, and we want to hear from you. The year was 1979, and it was a time of disco, political unrest, walkmans, and vampires. No fewer than 6 major film and TV projects premiered across the globe, providing a spectrum of bloodsuckers not seen before or since. Played for laughs or steeped in social commentary, from tortured souls to top of the food chain, adapted from literary works old and new, or completely original storylines, you just couldn't keep the undead dead, and the shock waves have continued to reverberate throughout history. Some of the finest performers in history have lined up to either inhabit or combat the fanged menace on screen, and we, the viewers, have reveled in their efforts over the past half-century. Tonight, we celebrate the vampires of 1979 and have assembled another extraordinary panel of guests. So let's bring everybody in and let's say hello to Chad Hawks.
Good evening.
Bobby Zier of Lugosi Theater.
A big you welcome.
Author and film historian Mike Mayo.
Thank you. I am not going to try to compete with that.
And Chicago playwright and actor Chris Hainsworth.
Thanks for having me.
And we are here to talk this evening about a sextet of vampire films, beginning with Love at First Bite, Thirst from Australia, Salem's Lot, Dracula from 1979, Nosferatu the Vampyre, and Vampire, all of which were from 1979 and all of which merit our attention. So thank you all for coming on the show tonight and welcome.
Thanks for inviting.
Thank you all for suffering along with me.
Yes, why do you hate us?
I love you. What are you talking about?
I guess it was helpful. Like 4 out of the 6 were on YouTube, so that made it really easy.
Yes, yeah. And I think Thirst is on Tobe. So I like the fact that these are accessible, that we didn't have to dig too deep. But there was something about 1979 that suddenly vampires were very much in vogue. I'm kind of curious, does anybody have any thoughts as to why that might have been? I know I have my theories.
Salem's Lot was published in 1975 and became a big bestseller. It was Stephen King's second novel. The first hardback edition made absolutely no mention of the fact that it was about vampires. It was just, this is a suspense story, something terrible happening in this little Maine town. And you're a third of the way into that book before you realize what it is. And it, hit the bestseller list. I think immediately kind of started the craze right there. And you can see its influence, particularly in, of course, Vampire, the made-for-TV movie that we'll be talking about later, which is clearly a blatant ripoff, but also in all the others. I really think we can pin this on Stephen King.
Okay, cool. When did Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire come out? Is that like 77?
It was very popular too. Also a big bestseller and went right to the top of the list.
And I think Dracula, the Broadway version, that had premiered in 1978, I believe, or 77.
I think it was 77.
Yeah, 77. And so there was something definitely percolating, and I think it all just kind of came to a head in 1979. But what I love about this year and this spectrum of vampire movies is that it is very much a spectrum. There is such a variety of types of vampires that we see. Some, the Frank Langella, very classical, and then some like Salem's Lot and Vampire and Thirst, especially, very unique spins on the bloodsucker mythos. I'm not even sure how to begin because we got so much to cover tonight. I would love to hear, because I think Dracula was probably the biggest name of the year. So why don't we go ahead and start there? Even though Love at First Bite beat it to the punch by coming out in, I think it was April of that year. And so it had already been parodied before it had actually premiered.
That Dracula is such, it's an adaptation of the play, all of that. But that Langella is really going for the big Byronic thing. And I think just nails it. That's the main thing that a vampire movie has got to do. You got to have a great vampire there. And Langella does it.
Yeah, I was really struck by the what seemed pretty obvious, the second wave feminist movement really shining through in this, and love at first bite as well. These women aren't victims. They're unapologetic in who they love and what they want. Langella's super sexy incarnation of Dracula, it just all fit together really nicely.
I love it. So the original 1931 version is my favorite movie. And I'm so impressed by the 1979 one, how all the characters are so relatable. Like Frank Langella, he's very sexy, but he also has a lot of like emotions going on with his Dracula. And Donald Pleasance, I think he's the best Dr. Seward I've ever seen.
He's certainly the hungriest Dr. Seward we've ever seen.
Yeah, apparently that really upset Badham, the director. Apparently to this day still has issue. He feels that steals every scene that Pleasance is in, but it just he asked, can I snack on some candies? Can I be eating some stuff? He was like, yeah, sure, go ahead. And it just adds so much to the character. That's the mark of an actor, to add that tertiary character development.
For sure.
Brilliant.
I love it when he eats the egg and that one drop of the yolk kind of comes down.
It's interesting because I've been rereading Dracula this week. I'm participating in a play reading this Saturday that also is connected to the Dracula mythos. I find it interesting that in Dracula, the Mina is a very proactive character, and that is granted a lot of deference in the book. But the movie kind of like shifts it into a romantic interest between Mina and Dracula, which seems indicative of the time, and probably an extension of the Broadway play of like making her somebody that he is in love with rather than something that he preys upon and lords over. And it's interesting because a lot of the lines that he has to her that are so-called like sort of the seduction lines of, kind of puffing himself up and coming on to her, like those are directly from the book, but in the book they're delivered to Jonathan Harker. Like there are no scenes in the book just of Mina and Dracula actually having a conversation. She's just something that he preys upon and actually turns in order to take revenge on everybody who's trying to stop him. So I thought it's interesting to sort of like, it's different in like how Freddy Krueger eventually becomes the protagonist of the nightmare films, but this is more of Dracula's not necessarily the antagonist in that movie either, that he's a frustrated romantic rather than a monster preying on the populace.
Right. That romantic idea between Dracula and Mina or Lucy, depending on which I'm not sure why they switched the names, but it gets a little confusing for the purists. I'm like, wait, who's Mina? Who's Lucy?
Actually, one time I Facebook messaged Gary Rhodes about that.
Okay,
I was interested too, and his thoughts were that they changed it because in the Broadway play the actual Lucy character isn't in it. It's like she dies before the event takes place.
Okay.
And he thought that like the name Lucy because it sounded more like Lucifer.
Ah.
Oh crap! Or did I read that? I might have read that in David Scull's book. I'm sorry.
That's okay. The idea of the romance that had been introduced in Dan Curtis's version of Dracula, the TV movie starring Jack Palance, and it also was, of course, in Dark Shadows in the form of Barnabas Collins. So this idea of Dracula as a romantic figure had been seen before, that relationship idea. Frank Langella is like our third major Dracula. We have Bela Lugosi in 1931. We have Christopher Lee in 1958. And then we have Frank Langella. And I think Frank Langella is the most openly kind of romantic and sexy one that we've seen before.
And has the best hair.
Oh man, such good hair.
Yeah.
The 70s hair. We got to talk about the 70s hair in all of these movies. It's just,
Well, when we talk about David Soul's hair in Salem's Lot,
Yeah.
you know,
Lugosi, when he's talking with people, you always get the sense that this is a monster in a room with a bunch of people, whereas Langella just feels like a part of the world, that he is not alien, that he slots in nicely, and he's very good at manipulating the situation, and he doesn't come off as otherworldly or off-putting. He is romantic. He is something that is desirable. In that drawing room scene where he shows up to dinner for the first time, where Langella shows up to dinner, and the conversation that he has with Mina, you know, when she sort of like challenges him and he sort of responds to it and they get into that flirty interaction. All of that is from Jonathan Harker's diary from when he was in Transylvania with the Count. Like all of those conversations that he has with Mina are with Jonathan Harker in Transylvania.
Well, and I like the adaptation here in that, you know, it picks up with the voyage of the Demeter. You know, like that's how this movie starts, is in the middle of that terrible storm and that crossing. I love the fact that it is Mina, or Lucy, the Lucy character, who discovers him on the shore. Like that's a very cool introduction of our character.
It really is, and I love how you see the fingers first, like it builds up such great anticipation, and then when he's on the carriage and first you see his shoes. Like they build him up as the iconic character he is.
Yep. And I love the fact that, I mean, because Lugosi had such distinctive use of his hands, they use Langella's fingers as our entry point as well.
Oh yeah, just how they use his fingers, they use his eyes, even like his hair. It's like elements that were great with Bela Lugosi, and it's like revised them. It's not the same. They do it a new way, but it's those same like elements that we already love.
It wasn't just the introductory scene to Dracula where we see his fingers come out, but there's repeated scenes, close-ups of his hands. To be able to top Lugosi is impressive, but I feel he did. You know,
one of the things that I noticed this time, and I looked it up because I was like, is that a special effect or did he somehow? But Langella has an astigmatism in his eye, so it moves of its own accord sometimes. And Badham captured it on film, like when he sees the blood at dinner. If you look at Langella's eye, it vibrates, and I was like, it suddenly does put him into the something is off category when you see something like that happen.
Yeah, I was watching the commentary track on the Shout Factory Blu-ray from a few years back, and the commentator, Konstantin Nazir, he pointed that out as well. I'd never noticed that before, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's right. You know, like you can actually see his eyes quivering and it kind of like sparks that animalistic desire in him. The production design on this film is incredible. You know, like it's just one of the most gorgeous presentations. I mean, like seeing the black and white version go to the color for Hammer, like that was revolutionary.
Much like they did with, like Donner did with Superman. We're going to take what can be considered genre fare and give it respect. Pleasance, Olivier, Langella, you know, they like Kate Nelligan is amazing as Mina. She's fantastic.
Yeah. The music as well. We have John Williams composing music for this that is stirring.
Can we talk about Olivier as Van Helsing? Again, if Langella is the third major Dracula, Olivier is our third major Van Helsing, you know, right behind Edward Van Sloan and Peter Cushing.
I thought he was the most relatable Van Helsing I've ever seen. I love the change of Mina is his daughter, and like the scene with him and Mina as the vampire. Like when he's crying, like your heart goes out to him.
The big change, of course, is spoiler alert, his early exit, as it were.
Right.
I don't know if we want to get into the ending too much, which
I have
always found problematic.
Let's talk about the magic kite.
Yes, that's it. He turns into a kite. That is just not right.
It's anticlimactic to say the least. I like what the idea of it. Like it could have been like a better way to do that one.
Yeah. The realization of it is not exactly what we might have hoped for.
Yeah, there's plus it's that once again that idea of rooting for Dracula. It feels like, because the last look of Kate Nelligan is like, oh, thank God he's not dead. And so it sort of changes the ending of the story, obviously, of like that it is not people vanquishing evil. It's like, no, these two romantic interests are going to have a future, and she's very excited about it. Not that you can't do that with, and I don't know how the Broadway play ends but I bet he doesn't turn into a kite.
Backing up just a few moments before we get the preternatural kite sailing off into the sunset, Langella himself was against fangs, apparently, which he wanted them to be as relatable as possible and as human as possible, which is great. I do regret that final scene in the bowels of the boat when he's dying or turning into a kite, possibly. I do wish that we had seen some fangs then.
Well, that's the thing is like, like what is the message we're supposed to be getting that, like that he does go on, because that feels wrong. Like it feels like the good guys have fought mightily and paid a heavy cost, and they brought him out into the light, and that should be it. I think it's an earned ending, and I don't think it makes Dracula any less of a tragic figure. The fact that he is just who he is. He is a vampire.
I wonder if they kind of felt like this is the best we can do with the special effects that we have. Remembering that we're talking about, way pre-digital effects times.
But considering all the other amazing effects we see in this film, all of Whitlock's matte paintings, Roy Arbogast's like great practical physical effects, I just feel like that this was a choice, and again, perhaps a misguided one.
And I think the stuff right before that, all the stuff on the boat, that's terrific. I love all of that going, on deck and then below decks. That's terrific.
And I love how how it's like a chase ending, going back to the book, how they're all in the car chasing after him.
Yes.
That's incredible to me, to be able to squeeze in a film that takes place in 1913, 1914.
I think that's right.
To have that year, a 1913 Hispano Suiza in mint condition, and say, hey, let's do a car chase scene in 1913 up against a horse-driven carriage.
I was very worried about that horse. I was very worried about that horse.
Yes.
Because that horse ran into that car.
Yep.
Oh, yes. Yep. And that is the exact example of why we don't use live animals so much. You can hear that horse chest hit that car.
Switching from our romantic version of Dracula, let's pivot over to our less romantic version of Dracula, but he really wants to be loved anyway. Nosferatu the Vampyre, directed by Werner Herzog and starring Klaus Kinski. Chad, let's start with you. Like, when did you see this one for the first time, the Nosferatu?
I think about 10 years ago. It wasn't when it came out. It's such a gorgeous film. You really have to like the Carpathians and also the music, Popol Vuh. But if you love those two things, Kinski's vampire is sadly beautiful and not at all a monster to me. I'm not sure. I'm curious how other people feel about that particular Nosferatu, because in fact, there's some comedic lines for me. Let's sit down a while. I laugh every time because of the pacing and the awkwardness, and then like, oh, well, you just threw me backwards into a chair and encouraged me to sit down. So yeah.
I first saw it when I was like 10 years old. I thought it was creepy. It was a little slow for me back then.
Oh yeah.
But then I rewatched it for this, and I loved it. He doesn't remind me of a monster. He reminds me of a ghost. And the way he's like so white, he's so white, like the shots of him, the way he's like moving. And it's so fascinating because like I forgot what he sounded like. Like when you watch the original Nosferatu, it's this monster, and you can't even imagine this creature talking. And to hear Klaus Kinski have like a very like simple kind of like a quiet voice. And even though he looked like a monster, he felt like a real monster, like something who really exists.
Okay, revealing my age. I was working as a movie reviewer for a newspaper, and I reviewed this when it first came out in '79. And then, as now, I found it very slow, visually impressive in a lot of ways. The rats, the rats, just whoever was the rat wrangler on that movie earned his or her paycheck. I tell you, just amazed at Kinski. Watching it again, Isabella Adjani, just every time she appeared on screen, I could not take my eyes off of her.
Powerful.
Just that beautiful Madonna face, and even in the beach scenes too. They just, I couldn't take my eyes off of her. And to me, she's the movie. I thought she was just magnificent.
I had seen it on cable as a child, but I hadn't watched it all the way through until it came up for this. And I actually watched the original silent version as well, just to sort of have a baseline of 1-to-1 what was going on. I went back and checked. I was like, did I just miss something? But because it comes up that it's written, produced, and directed by Werner Herzog with no sort of adaptation credit given to anyone. And I was like, wow, Werner, I mean, all respect in the world, but you're actually using the name Count Dracula this time as opposed to Count Orlok in the original, because now it's in public domain and you can do what you want. That's bigger balls than most of your characters that play have. That is just yeah, do you like this little thing I threw off? It's something, it's nothing. It's, it's sort of not only is it there are shots that are replicated from the original, but it is also Dracula now in name as well. This Nosferatu, this Dracula, is much sadder than any of the other ones we get. That he is just kind of going on because he does. It's not about the predatory act, and he's not bloodthirsty, and he does all these things, but when you sit with him, it's like sitting with your really depressed friend who just sort of yeah, I don't know,
want to hug him, right?
What's it?
Well, no, not really.
What's it all mean, man? I don't know, man. Yeah, I don't know either. All right, don't bite me.
A couple people have mentioned the pacing already, and I agree. I saw it in college as part of the a film studies program. And it's such a gorgeous piece of filmmaking, like most of Herzog's work. There's so much intention behind it. It feels like every choice is an absolute choice. We are going to sit here and we're going to watch the sun go down for 5 minutes. And there's something in that 5 minutes that makes that moment what it is. But you have to be willing to go along with it. This is one of those movies I think goes down better a second time around when it is the movie that it is, as opposed to the movie that you might want it to be. The music is so extraordinary and so haunting, just that repeating kind of droning, chanting. And I couldn't agree more, Mike. I think that Isabella Adjani is such a strike. The thing is, not a lot happens in this movie. For it to take an hour and 45 minutes is almost kind of extraordinary when you think of what the actual screen action is. But yes, the rats and the bringing of the plague and that whole metaphor that is Dracula. I just love that. I love that it makes it an art film just right there. You're like, okay, yep. I haven't seen that before. All 11,000 rats that got trucked into Holland.
And the other thing, remember how in Herzog's other films, he is always so involved with the natural world. And he's clearly letting that really go here too. And all of the landscapes in it, even if you don't love them, you got to be impressed by it.
Isabella Adjani is once again the real protagonist of she's the one who takes action, and she's the one who does something. And it's the same as from the silent version of in that the character's name is Hutter rather than Harker, and he just is kind of this affable dude who kind of winds up in these circumstances. And Lucy in those movies is the one who actually does the research, finds out what she has to do, and lays down her life to do it. You know, and of course, in the 79 version, it's all for naught.
Right.
Which is, once again, feels indicative of a post-Vietnam sort of society that, like, even when you do make this grand heroic gesture, in the end, it doesn't matter because evil's going to keep going on.
It really made me feel like I was in that world. And it felt like a world that was much more, even though it was, you know, there were makeups and different looks, it felt like a very real world. More real, like the Franklin Langella movie, it felt like a Dracula movie. This felt like it felt like I was really in Germany and these characters were really happening. Because it feels so real, those are like the ickiest rats I've seen in movies. Like even like in Willard, they feel like movie rats, you know, even though they're real. But this, it's just like, you really imagine, what if like my town was just overrun with these things?
Yeah.
I'm sure you can go to Holland now and still see the same those rats, because I don't think they wrangled every one of those rats. Was that done with a permit, or was that just like let them out and then run away, grab the equipment and go?
Well, and that's the rat lovers, but like,
yeah, exactly. I feel like, you know, like the idea of Werner Herzog showing up and being like, so I'm going to unleash 11,000 rats in your city. Is that cool?
And then I'll release 10,000 pythons to deal with the rats, and then we'll get some gorillas to deal with the pythons.
I think we have to talk about how Kinski and Herzog had a notoriously frictious relationship. This was only their second movie together after Aguirre, The Wrath of God. They were just like colossal, you know, two massive egos, and they both had very distinct ideas of how things should go. What we get is, it's a really extraordinary performance. You know, I don't know how much of it came from Herzog. I don't know how much it came from Kinski, but I think the result is pretty incredible.
I have not heard of any, you know, great disagreements on the set of this, the way there were on all the other movies. But I agree. They really got it right. I mean, I think Herzog got what he wanted on the screen from Kinski in this one.
And every line he says, like, you're not expecting the way he's going to say it. It was one of my favorite lines from the book is, "You dwellers in the city cannot enter the feelings of the hunter." And when I did it in my video, I did it like how I imagined Dracula to do it, like real villainous and everything. And he says it with despair.
Right. You can't know what it's like to be, you know, to be me.
The scene he has with Renfield when he's telling him about all the rats and everything he's got planned. Renfield's so pumped for it, and Dracula seems like bored. Like, I've done this before, I have to do it again.
That is a notable scene for me, where you just got this passe ancient Nosferatu, who's Renfield is such a huge character. The two of them next to each other is like black and white and Technicolor. That's the one jarring scene in the whole film for me, is when they finally meet, and Dracula is just like, "Meh, go away." You know, I don't have the same enthusiasm for my undead life as you do for your psychotic life. So yeah, jarring.
Chris, having just seen the silent version versus, what were some of kind of like the most notable differences for you?
The change from Orlok, who is monstrous, and there's always something once again, there's always something predatory about the vampires from the past, whereas the ones in the modern day, there is this sympathy towards them, because I do feel like the film is sympathetic towards Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu, as opposed to Max Schreck's Nosferatu, who was this hideous, you know, monster. Everything looks monstrous, and everything is coded monstrous, because even in the silent version, Renfield, whose name is Knock in that one, starts out looking evil as well. That there's this very sort of coded, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And that's sort of, there's that black and white simplicity, forgive the pun, there's that black and white simplicity of good guys and bad guys that I think particularly in most of the movies we watched for this. I think the 79 made for TV vampire is the one that actually only has, that's like the least sympathetic vampire in the movies that we watched. So yeah, I think that's the main difference, is the approach to who Dracula / Orlok is the main difference. But a lot of the shots are the same. It's also, you know, in terms of silent films, it's the watching two people talk from a distance without any cards of what's going on. You're like, yeah, you could probably move, you know, the editing hadn't quite come to the forefront yet, but it's still, there are some amazing effect shots, particularly for the time that it was put together. There's like the whole sequence where they get on the, Hutter gets on the carriage that is being driven by Orlok, and it goes into a negative view, and it's speeding. They use fast motion photography, and you know, when Orlok, I actually think the death of Nosferatu Orlok is more interesting in the silent version than in this one, where the cock crows and he stands up, and they use like camera tricks to make him dissolve into nothing. That's more of a striking image than, I get why they did what they did in terms of like, oh, Klaus Kinski falls down and then the doctor stakes him through the heart, but then that doctor ends up getting arrested for murder. It's
right.
You know, the silent one, it's a more, it felt more like a fairy tale, like a scary fairy tale, like the old Grimm's Brothers versions. In Count Orlok, he was like, you know, a pure monster. Whereas this one, it felt like everyone just felt so more like it was happening in reality.
Let us jet on to our funniest of Draculas, and that's George Hamilton at Love at First Bite. And as I mentioned earlier, this was the one that was the first out of the gate. It came out in April 1979. And George Hamilton, you know, had kind of, I think because of his own self-deprecating presentation, like he'd become a bit of a joke. But he's so good in this, and he was one of the producers. You know, he obviously knew that this was going to play to his strengths. But I think he's a terrific light comedian here. Curious to hear people's thoughts on Love at First Bite.
Disco. Oh, God. I hated it then. I hate it now.
You hate the movie, or you hate disco?
Disco. Artie Johnson as Renfield throws the whole thing into a different sphere completely. Did this come out before or after Zorro the Gay Blade?
This was his comeback.
Yeah, this was before, and then Gay Blade was, I think, 81.
Because they're doing the same kind of thing. And you're right. He is very good at this. And okay, it's a limited range, but boy, did he ever nail it right there.
Yes. This, I think, is the only one that I saw in the theaters. My parents took me to see this as a kid. And there are jokes that have stayed with me for 45 years. I mean, Richard Benjamin pulling out the Star of David and him going, "Why don't you find yourself a nice Jewish girl?" That's just something that has stuck with me since 1979. And actually, Richard Benjamin's entire performance is that level of over the top and unhinged and yet completely grounded. And I buy it is everybody in this movie is deftly comedic. Even Susan St. James, everybody understands the assignment and delivers 100%.
This is my first time ever seeing it.
Oh,
and
really?
I'm impressed by how he was so funny, but he was still like a believable Dracula. It was like the right level of wackiness. And I agree, like the Renfield in the movie, he was so good at it. I love the running jokes they do with the mice, and when he's describing the spider sandwich and Dracula throws up.
On this one, I could talk all night. This is the one that I also saw in the theater. It's the one that I said, I'm going to grow up to be a vampire. I've since gone back and watched George Hamilton's early stuff, Where the Boys Are on. I got to meet him when he was in Chicago, and he had done The Birdcage, and I was one of two fans out in the alley, thanks to our friend Brian Kirst. And I was just so excited, and talked to him about this film. I was like, this is why I'm me. And he just had such a suave performance, and yet, yeah, all the dry humor. I have so many favorite moments from this, including the 76 Superior Sovereign hearse they use in there. That affected me. I wound up with a 68, but same model just earlier. There are so many, like Chris said, so many lines that have stuck with me. But also another late 70s, very Cindy Sondheim is even more so than Dracula from 79. She is unapologetically, I will do the drugs I want to do. I will sleep who I want to sleep with. I'm going to warn you up front, don't get attached. And that reality of, we have the classic tale of this ancient count who has loved this person, maybe through multiple lifetimes, maybe not. It might just be a transference of this obsession. And here in this comedy, we get slapped with the reality. She comes home, she pulls off the wig, her place is a disaster. He's checking for rats, love me as I am or fly out the window, your choice. So there's a lot of heart to this that I think gets overlooked.
I agree that the scene, the moment you go into her apartment and see what it's like, that just kind of turns it into a different movie.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great observation, Chad. Like the idea of kind of like peeling back the fantasy, because in most Dracula movies, that is who our female character is. It is a male fantasy to be conquered and fought over. But, Susan St. James is just straight up. She is independent. She doesn't just fall for him, even when he uses his magic on her. Like she's still using, she's still making conscious choices to be with or not be with.
We also see more of that. Chris mentioned earlier the sympathy for that, the sympathy for the devil character, where he even laments, like, I have to dress like a head waiter all of my life. I don't get to celebrate holidays. I've never, I don't see the sun.
I haven't had garlic toast.
And again, the hair. He's got the hair nailed down tight.
And I have to say, like how we were talking about how she feels like a real person with our apartment's a mess. Is even though it's a comedy, all the relationships felt very real. It had a really great balance of like comedy and drama.
Well, and Richard Benjamin, for whatever reason, like he just kept showing up. Because I thought he was in all of these movies in the 70s, and it just feels like he was in all of these movies in the 70s. Like, like I went back and looked at his filmography. It's just that he's in some of my favorite movies, like Westworld, like The Sunshine Boys, like this. As you said, Chris, he plays things just that like R.D. Johnson is very much a caricature. He's a cartoon. Richard Benjamin's character is just like right at that edge of hysteria, but it feels like a real person who just happens to live at that edge of hysteria.
Yes. My favorite one, it's a running gag of like every time he like tries to kill Dracula and people could drag him away, it's like, I'm a doctor. No, it's okay, I'm a doctor. It just, he says it with all the authority of somebody who is a doctor. This and I did see Zorro the Gay Blade at the theater, and I also saw Scavenger Hunt, which was also a Richard Benjamin film. I don't know if you ever saw that, but that was a huge part of my childhood as well. So yes, George Hamilton and Richard Benjamin, as far as I knew, were in all of the movies when I was young.
Mike, I got to ask, did you review this one when you were working?
No, I dodged this one. The guy who was the other movie reviewer, I think, caught it.
What was your feeling on it, like when you didn't finally see it?
I enjoyed it, but it was just a George Hamilton movie, and I didn't have yet any real emotional attachment to it. I think I saw it on HBO a few years later.
Oh, there were two really great references to older Draculas I caught that I really liked. How he refers to the incident, how the lead lady in this, how she was actually Mina in the 1931 version. So I like how they refer to that year.
That's right.
And then at the end, when they're grabbing Dracula and they just get his cape. In the original Broadway play, they did a special effect where Dracula would disappear from the stage. Dr. Seward would grab one end of the cape, and Jonathan Harker would grab the other. And Bela Lugosi would have his back to the audience, and he'd like slip out the cape and through a trap door. So I felt like that was a reference to that.
That's cool.
Yeah, there were also Children of the Night. Shut up. First line of the movie, it never fails to kill me. And also, I don't drink wine and I don't smoke shit.
That was my favorite.
My older sister took me to see this. I was not supposed to be seeing films with that kind of language and whatnot. And fortunately for me, the final line when she says, I can never really get my shit together in cell 7 anyway, the first thing I did was I got home and repeated it to my dad out of excitement, but I misheard and I said, I don't really get my ship together in cell 7. So we squeaked by on that one, but
I'm actually going to start using that as an expression.
Yeah.
I gotta get my shit together.
makes sense.
Before we move on to the small screen, I'd like to go down under. This is a movie that it was new to everybody on the panel. I'm curious to hear what people's thoughts on Rod Hardy's Thirst.
I really loved it. I'm so glad you put it on the list. It was so different from what I was expecting. Like when I read what it was about, it felt like kind of like some echoes of Stepford Wives. I liked the and I loved how like nightmarish it was when they're putting her through the like the experiment to make her into a vampire.
The conditioning, yeah,
the conditioning, it felt like a real nightmare.
You picked up on it. I really like cars, and I really like cars in film, and the 60s Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud 2 in this was perhaps my favorite part. It wasn't at all what I expected. I don't know what my expectations were, but I was confused, I think, overall by whether this it kind of had a feel of a made-for-TV movie, but it got a theatrical release in Australia. But the mechanics behind it, they had fake steel fangs they would put in, and yet their eyes would glow. So I was very confused as to do they have a supernatural power, or are we seeing how they see themselves? David Hemmings, he was absolutely my favorite character. He really buoyed up the whole effort. I enjoyed it as a time capsule, and also as just a different feel for filming from another country.
I thought there was a lot of interesting ideas. I did appreciate the concept, and I think Joss Whedon must have seen this movie because of the whole automated blood extraction and packaging, and the fact that they're like, a lot of the language they use is like, oh, well, we filter out any of these things that could possibly cause a reaction, and it's this and just the whole like the tour going through the factory. There were elements to it. There's a lot of the atmosphere that I really dug about it. I'm still confused, I guess. I'm like, of what anybody's real plan was, or why they needed to do what they did. And that was like, narratively, it reminded me a lot more of like a David Lynch film of like, there's all these things going on, and I think I understand what's happening. Oh no, that just happened. Now I don't know what's going on. That it has a certain dreamlike quality to it. Why are they torturing her to get her to this place? That why do they feel that this is the way to get her to drink the blood? And why do they need her to do that? There was a lot about it visually I enjoyed, and a lot of atmospherically, narratively, I was kind of left out in the dark.
I was kind of reminded of the TV show from a few years before then, The Prisoner, that had that same kind of paranoia to it. Again, David Hemmings, really like David Hemmings, and Henry Silva, seeing him in there too. Two of my favorite guys like that. I did wonder if ancestress is a real word. which they called her at one time or referred to. And the whole gothic thing, woman in a nightgown running through this place, and the weird dream sequences that went on way too long. And at a couple of times, I somehow, because of the Australian accents, kind of was reminded of Dame Edna, which was exactly the wrong thing to think about. Barry Humphries and all that. But all that said, I enjoyed it. I mean, I watched it. It was very much a time capsule thing, and any movie where Henry Silva lands on the power poles, the high tension lines, you got to love that. So I'm glad you put it in, because it's the one of these that I hadn't seen and really wouldn't have. I'm sure I wouldn't have seen it.
For me, what I like about this, and I just did a panel on Ari Aster, and his 3 films are all kind of about cults to varying degrees. And this is very much a cult movie in that it is about bringing people in. But I love the fact that they are trying to bring her in. And I feel like it is because of her ancestry to Elizabeth Bathory that it's very important that she be kind of on the board of directors. That's kind of what it is. It's like, to give the cult its cachet, they need to have this descendant of Elizabeth Bathory in the mix. And so that's why it's important to them that they indoctrinate her. I was also really fascinated by the social commentary that's going on there, where we don't have any poor people who are vampires. It's all the rich people. And who do they feed upon? The poor people who have no other options. They are the cattle.
Drinkers and blood cows.
Exactly. They refer to them as blood cows. They're not even humans, And I really enjoyed seeing that different view of vampirism, because I'd never seen that before, that kind of industrialized version of it.
And I love the scene when they're giving the tour.
Right.
And the one gentleman with the longer hair, when he's like taking the picture, like it sort of reminded me of the Twilight Zone. Of that particular scene. And I love the social commentary of that, of the wealthy just kind of looking at the poor these aren't even people.
And I had the same thought that Mike did of I thought of the colony from The Prisoner as well, when she was walking around, and it almost looked like the colony from The Prisoner when she was walking around meeting all of the blood cows and hanging out with them.
Unlike our other 3 females, this is a woman who does not have any control over her destiny. She's drugged, she is coerced, she is gaslit. It's not a good day for women through this lens. And I thought that was, again, kind of juxtaposed to the other films that we've been watching, where it is about empowering your females and they are making conscious choices. This woman has had all of her choices taken away from her.
The most evil villain in the film is the woman who is on the board of directors. Right. She is the most villainous character in the whole film.
The experience of watching it is almost like it's the experience of the main character, because you don't know what's real, what's not. You're as surprised, and you almost feel as helpless as her.
Well, I mean, you are kind of thrown into it at the very beginning, where you don't know what's happening, and then they play that scene again with more context. I don't think you'd all seen Vampire, the TV movie from 1979. So let's go ahead and talk about that one, and then we'll close out with Salem's Lot. But Vampire, 1979, it stars Richard Lynch as our Prince Wojciech, and Jason Miller of Exorcist fame, and E.G. Marshall, probably best known to horror fans from his turn in Creepshow.
The first thing I noticed, and again, this is going back to my days as a film reviewer. At the time, I was living in Southwest Virginia and was reviewing for the Roanoke Times. And the main female character, played by Catherine Harold, was from my neck of the woods. And so I paid very close attention to everything she was in. Thought a really nice actress, accomplished, had a kind of limited career. And I think from everything I know about her, kind of got fed up with Hollywood bullshit and just kind of resigned from the business. I wish I could see this movie where I could actually see all of it and hear all of it. And watching it on the YouTube version, I couldn't. And I could Steve Bochco, the guy that did so much other great TV, was behind it from the beginning to the end. Such a clear ripoff of Salem's Lot that I never quite got over all of that. I certainly enjoyed Richard Lynch's performance. I thought he was terrific in it. And as I said at the beginning of this, when we talk about our 70s hair, this was the crowning glory. Boy, did he have hair.
Yes.
And it's blonde hair too.
Oh,
Is it?
boy.
I don't know if there was a blonde vampire or blonde Dracula character prior to this, but
It was San Francisco.
yeah,
it's set in San Francisco.
And a young Jessica Walter.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
That was a surprise and a treat. Jason Miller was unfortunately the weakest link in this otherwise really heartfelt acting. I didn't buy him as really being attached to the emotions that he was acting through, but everybody else, I loved it. The tie-in of E.G. Marshall, his partner laying the same vampire to rest 35, 40 years prior. I thought it all tied in nicely. The kind of the second act being mostly expository and pretty slow, but also very revelatory, and how this was definitely a product of the 70s, where we had the cliche single mom. You trust your older next door single neighbor with your kid. It's okay if you leave that kid at home while you go out to fight vampires. A lot of good 70s ethics coming through. But I love the fact that these are two older guys who go out in a station wagon. That was a 77. Mercury Marquis, what is it, a Colony Park, and they fight a vampire. I learned, dug in a little bit, and this was meant to be the pilot for a series that didn't happen. So
it feels like that too. Like it, I mean, like the way it ends feels like a pilot. Like we're going to go on chasing this vampire through the rest of this.
Does anybody know, was this before or after Kolchak the Night Stalker?
This is long after Kolchak. Kolchak was like early 70s.
Okay.
But one of the writers is a Kolchak writer. The director and the two writers, I was trying to figure out who met who first, but there was LA Law tie-in. Two of them worked on McCloud. Two of them worked on Columbo's, Hill Street Blues, First Blood, and then the Kolchak tie-in too. So.
Well, and Michael Cazole, who co-wrote with Stephen Bochco, I saw that he was one of the screenwriters for First Blood, the Sylvester Stallone. So you got Bochco and you got this other guy, like kind of collaborating on this. I didn't realize, Mike, that you knew Catherine Harold, because I'm a huge fan of hers from The Sender, 1982, and she's also in another Bat movie, Nightwing.
I really, really liked it. It was definitely more of like a normal vampire movie than Thirst. But I thought the vampire, he was very 70s, but he was also very old school too. It was 70s hair, but it was in the vampire style. I liked his cape, so I thought he was a great vampire. I actually liked Jason Miller in it. I like how it was the adventure at the end, how they had to go like long distances to destroy the coffins. So it was like all the classical things about vampire movies I love, but just done like in the 70s way. I like Jason Miller in it because I think of him as such a 70s actor. So to me, he just seemed like a he seemed like perfect in like that 70s atmosphere. So maybe that's what I was seeing.
Well, and actually that's what I was going to say, is that I feel like we don't get to see a lot of Jason Miller like on screen. He had a very kind of limited screen career. And obviously he's best known as Damien Karras from The Exorcist. And he also showed up in The Ninth Configuration, directed by William Peter Blatty. But I feel like he's very much doing Damien Karras here. And so I feel like what you were saying, Chad, is that it doesn't feel like we're seeing a different color. Like he's still kind of painting from that same paintbrush. It's that dark, brooding, and it doesn't feel like we're getting the same, tortured quality that he might have if he were to lose his wife. But I also like Jason Miller just because I like seeing Jason Miller do anything. I'll watch Damian Karras, read the phone book.
And I'm kind of that way with E.G. Marshall. I mean, I just think
E.G. Marshall is so good in this.
Yeah.
He's so fantastic.
I was actually surprised by some of it in this era. Everything else we've talked about, which seems to have sympathy for the vampire in it. This is like, no, he's just a monster.
Yeah.
He gets petty and mean. So when he shows up to sort of seduce Catherine Harold, I was like, oh, okay, this is the beat where, they have this great romance. And it's like, no, he just rips her throat out and leaves her for Jason Miller to find, because Jason Miller had the audacity to involve the FBI in all of his looted art.
Right.
It's very petty and small. I did get the feeling it did feel like a pilot. It very much felt like what it was. But I do think that even in those lines, there were surprising things. There were just the whole I've been hoarding art for centuries. Well, of course that's a very practical thing that makes sense to me. I would have watched the series if it kept going.
I really liked how he was hoarding art too. It reminded me in Dracula how he's been hoarding money for centuries, and it answers that question: how did these vampires have so much money?
They're in it for the long run.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on Vampire?
Has it ever been available in, I guess, was it ever a DVD?
I have not found a legit release of it yet. But, I always hold out hope that, the more people watch bootlegs and things like that, it'd be like, oh, I guess we could actually make some money off this. So we can always hold out hope.
Because it was really, I was really impressed by it. It deserves one.
Let us move into our second small screen effort, which certainly has the bigger reputation. And that's Salem's Lot. This was the second Stephen King adaptation. So Carrie had come out in 1976. And then this was the next Stephen King adaptation. And by then he was already a huge literary star, because The Shining had come out by then as well. I feel like I consistently take Salem's Lot for granted, probably because of its 3-hour running time. It's not one I revisit all the time. Mm-hmm. But this most recent revisit, I was like, this is so much better than I remembered. And I think it has to do with the fact that it takes its time and we spend time with characters. We have character interactions that don't actually pay off toward the main plot because they don't have to.
I think I was about 10 years old because I remember I had the videotape. It was the edited version. It was called Salem's Lot the movie, and it had some of the stuff taken out.
Right.
But still, I loved it. It was a great vampire, and I loved, as a kid watching, I really liked Mark Petrie. I related to him because he knew what to do because he watched monster movies.
Right.
And I love that aspect. But yeah, I think it's like you said, they take their time with it, so you're able to really get invested in all the characters. The house, the old Marston house, it has just such a great atmosphere. Like Ben Mars says, you can feel it across the entire town, even when the scene isn't showing it, you feel it.
Okay, two different reactions to the original miniseries and the videotape version, which is, like you were saying, Salem's Lot the movie. I have not seen the full length of it in a long, long time. What I really remember, of course, is the vampire makeup. I mean, that's just, again, okay, it's copying the Nosferatu makeup, but he really makes that work a lot. Again, like you were saying, the nice slow pace of it, really kind of getting into the same pace as the novel. It has a novelistic pace rather than a film pace. That I thought was really terrific. David Soul, I think, held up better than I thought he would, and that's not just any kind of nostalgia. I thought he was fine in it. All of the characters, I thought, did a really good job with it. I would say one of the more successful adaptations of King.
I mean, this is also lean and mean Stephen King. Like, this is before he was writing, 500, 600-page novels. Like, this is lean, and that's why so much of it, I think, gets onto the screen, is because it wasn't so much that you had to deal with.
I'm a huge fan of the novel, and I think as an adaptation, it's an extremely successful adaptation of the novel. They changed certain things, but I did see it in 1979 when it was on, because which is shocking for me because I was not into horror movies at the time. I was a big fraidy cat when I was 9 years old, but my family was watching it, and the image of Ralphie Glick at the window has stuck with me for 45 years.
Yep.
There are just images that have been ingrained into my psyche that are like the Jeffrey Lewis sitting in the rocking chair going, teacher, that these things have lived rent free in my brain since 1979. I do think it's one of those King adaptations that works well as a movie, even though they changed, because like in the book, Stryker and Barlow is not Nosferatu like. Barlow is very much Dracula like in the fact that he is, and they've sort of transferred that personality into James Mason's Stryker, who is more the familiar. So, but I think it works for this. I think that in a book you have time to balance that. There's like a shift in the antagonist in the book from Stryker to Barlow that you don't necessarily have. So I think that was actually a smart adaptation choice. But yeah, it is. It's one of the most frightening things I had ever seen on television, and one of the most frightening things I would see on television, I think, until I watched Twin Peaks in 1991. That it is, they get away with a lot without actually breaking any standards and practices. So but yes, I think it works because it takes its time. It has the setup, and it's that thing that's tightly winding and winding and winding and winding until it snaps, and then everything falls apart so quickly. And I think it's interesting because like 1979 is the last time that a story like this could take place, that you do have isolated communities that could just vanish off the face of the earth. And people are like, I wonder what happened to them. Now we are so interconnected. I think Lance Kerwin, God bless him and God rest his soul, is great as Mark Petrie. And I feel like both Mark and Ben are both Stephen King stand-ins from two different points in his life. Mark is him as a kid, in that I'm interested in this stuff because I want to see when it's coming. And then Ben is him as an adult, as a writer trying to deal with the trauma from his own childhood.
I have to admit, until The Simpsons spoofed this with Milhouse outside the window, there are so many Simpsons references that, as an adult, I went, I need to know where this is coming from. I hadn't read the book. I think the fact that it was a Nosferatu with really interesting, not just rat teeth, but conjoined teeth that split off, and I don't know. I wasn't drawn to it. I didn't see it as a kid, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I sought it out. It struck me as creepy from when the two brothers go missing. I don't know. There was just something real world creepy about that to me at the time. And rewatching it for this, there's still just a hint of creepy beyond vampires that hits me, and that is terrifying in itself. I've enjoyed it every time I've watched it, and it's an investment, so it hasn't been that many times, but I do really appreciate, we were just talking about vampires collecting antiquities, that this vampire, I've never understood why they use both names when the other partner has no intention of showing up ever, but and it just seems to cause more
confusion and
unnecessary scrutiny by the townsfolk. But this is a smart vampire, even though there's really nothing. The vampire is kind of two-dimensional, but still enjoyable.
I think our Barlow character is very much just a monster. Like, there doesn't seem to be any kind of thought process going on there. And I do like Reggie Nalder's kind of like energy as our main vampire, but the performances across the board, I think, are kind of extraordinary, especially for a made-for-TV movie. You mentioned David Soul. I admit I kind of had written him off as TV actor, and watching this, I think he's great. I think he's just fantastic. He gives a great grounded performance. I love his kind of like interaction with Bonnie Bedelia. I love the fact that he's talking about like coming back as a, like he was a kid here and he tries to connect with his school teacher. Like there's a lot of humanity there. And I think he handles all of it. He's also the reluctant hero because he's scared. He doesn't want to be there. He's kind of feeling drawn to be there. But then you've got James Mason, kind of as the main antagonist. And James Mason is just so good on this. Like he has so much low boiling menace and he's completely unflappable throughout.
The scene with David Soul in the morgue with Marjorie Glick when he's putting the tone depressors together and reciting the Lord's Prayer and yet terrifyingly calling for Bill is one of my favorite scenes of him being like, okay, this is Bill. Like I have woken from nightmares and like had that same shrill calling out in my voice kind of. I think it really sort of lends, because even though he knows what's going on, when he finally sees it happening, it is even more terrifying. That it's knowing it. It's the difference between knowing and seeing, and he really plays the hell out of that scene. I think it's great. I think once again, everybody's performances are very, very good.
I love Kenneth McMillan as our sheriff or our constable.
Yeah.
He's terrific. I love Jeffrey Lewis. I love Ed Flanders as the doc. I love Lou Ayres as our school teacher. Like, I just feel like, and Bonnie Bedelia is just wonderful. Like, I just feel like you just go right down the line. And I don't feel like there's a bad performance in this entire cast. And I don't feel like anybody does anything less than kind of exemplary, really subtle work. And I was talking earlier about like, characters, the whole thing with the affair, the George Zunzas, and Boom Boom Bonnie. It seems like that's all there to cast suspicion on them when they leave town, but that never pays off. It's just an incident that happens to, send a couple of our characters to their doom. But beyond that, like there's no real payoff to that whole affair subplot.
No, it's very much like the flavor of the book in that like so much of the book is just about the book is very similar. He would revisit a lot of it later in Needful Things of like, it's this small town and this small town is its own microcosm and it's kind of cut off from the rest of the world. But this is how all of the dark things that go on behind closed doors, even before the vampires show up and start feeding on people. It's very much, I feel like that's the one thing that managed to get the thing they made time for to sort of give that flavor of the book in the miniseries.
Everything we've been saying that we really like about the miniseries is straight from the book.
Oh, I agree. It makes it feel like a real town. And when you mentioned like the subtleties that the actors bring to it, there's a scene when James Mason is arranging for the crate to come in that has Mr. Barlow. He looks nervous.
Yeah,
and it's not over. It's just like that perfect level of nervousness. Even that, it gives his character who is that charming villain. It gives him vulnerability too.
And I didn't mention it, but this is directed by Tobe Hooper, who he obviously was famous for directing Texas Chainsaw Massacre and then Eaten Alive. But this was kind of like a big break for him because this showed he could do something other than kind of weird, twisted, drive-in oriented fare. And this, I would think, directly led to his gig on Poltergeist.
Particularly for miniseries on television, the camera movement is a lot more dynamic than you would find on anything in television. I think about when the Petrie family is sitting at the table and Barlow comes bursting through the window, and it's all about the pull in and what's going on the tape. It's a lot more dynamic than you would find in your standard definition television shot.
And I think there's some really effective jump scares when the dog is found dead in the cemetery, and then when we see the figure rise up and take out one of the Glick boys. Like, I genuinely jumped. I was like, oh gosh. And there were a couple of those that I thought were really effectively staged jump scares that you wouldn't think would work as well as they do on the small screen.
Jeffrey Lewis jumping into the grave with and Danny Glick's, that one still, it's like, you know it's coming, and it's so sudden and sharp that it still makes you jump out of your skin.
And I do appreciate the fact that Jeffrey Lewis is the only one attempting a Maine accent.
I have to again talk about James Mason and how good he is in that, and to have an actor of his caliber in with a group of character actors. And yes, he kind of steals it, but he doesn't unbalance things. Yeah. It is very much an ensemble piece all the way through. And let me give another prop to the book. I just reread it a couple of years ago, and it really stands up. That's why I can say everything we're talking about here is straight from the book. Reading it again, I enjoyed it just as much as I did the first time.
Great source material. I think it's a really solid adaptation of that source material. And I think it's a well-performed version of that adaptation. Like, it just feels like everything coalesced. And again, I think the fact that it's 3 hours long, keeps it from being a perennial Halloween favorite, let's say. But I think it's absolutely worth revisiting if you've kind of seen it, when you were a kid and you remember it. I think it's worth going back and checking it out again to be able to appreciate these nuances and appreciate the intricacies and those great character moments.
And since we're talking about 1979, kids, this is what it was like. The hair, everything else. And what Chris was saying about this being the last time that you could really have a town that was that isolated. Yeah, that's true too. It was, no internet, rabbit ears on the TV. That's what it was. That was the world.
Was the epilogue, was that fairly faithful to the book?
I think so. Yes, it's where they're in Mexico.
Guatemala.
Yeah. In the book, it's Mexico. In the TV series, it was Guatemala. But yes, that's one of those sort of similarities of, like, if you think about the things that carry over between all of the films, there are certain images, like in the 79 Dracula, there's the pressing the crucifix to Lucy's right, or I forget if they messed up the names of that one, but that is just like in Salem's Lot. The same thing happens with Marjorie Glick. Catherine Harold having to be staked by Jason Miller is very much David Soul having to stake Bonnie Bedelia, which is very much, having to stake the girlfriend in 1979. That there are these things that carry across. They aren't exactly tropes, but they are things that find their way into all the various incarnations that we saw in the same year.
They all have a dramatic impact to them. They still work.
Oh, even like the idea of something being at the window, in 1979 Dracula, it's the bat. In Love First Bite, it's the black chicken, and and this is it's the kids, Danny Glick at the window. Yeah. So it's that reoccurring theme, each one doing a different time.
That's a great observation, Bobby.
Yeah.
And I want to talk again about the window scene. It is so scary. It's all three versions. It's such a great trademark scare. There's how they do it, 3 versions, but each time is different. Because it reminds me of Peter Pan. How the boy flies at the window, but like a nightmare version of it.
And that's why they use it in all the advertising that you see for just about any version of Salem's Lot. That's the image you'll see first.
Very memorable.
Yeah, it's funny what Mike was saying about the book, about how when you're reading it, you don't know I mean, now anybody who picks it up will,
Right.
because now the cover is Barlow from the TV series on the
Right.
cover with his fangs, but the original was just Salem's Lot in script on the cover. No sort of hint to what was going on. And there was, I forget if it happened if Night Shift, I think the short story Jerusalem's Lot was published before the book Salem's Lot, but it was collected in Night Shift, and it's set in Jerusalem's Lot in the 1700s, and then Salem's Lot is the same town later on. So, but yeah, now it's impossible to escape, but there is that slow burn about it that I appreciate it. And I read that like several screenwriters took a shot at trying to get it down to 2 hours, and it was just impossible, which is why it ended up in the television branch of Warner Brothers, who were able to, quite frankly, treat it in the way, like nowadays it would probably be like an 8-episode Netflix series.
Yeah.
And they would really take the time with it.
And I appreciate the fact that they did, because I think that's the best thing about it is how much nuance and detail gets put into it. I don't ever feel like it drags. You know, it was a 3-hour sit, but I didn't feel those 3 hours. I mean, I feel like Nosferatu the Vampyre, the Kinski, feels longer than Salem's Lot.
You're going real time through the Borgo Pass. So, you have a week.
Well, and speaking of spending a fair amount of time, I wanted to say thank you all for investing the time in watching 6 movies, including a 3-hour one and one that felt like 5 hours, as well as spending a healthy amount of time discussing them. So thank you all for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Always fun.
I love that.
And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.